I knew the world had irrevocably shifted the moment Claire placed that freezing plate in front of me. The clink of porcelain against the oak table emitted a dry, hollow crack, the sound of a snapping bone. Across the table, Andrew, the only son I had ever cherished, was casually slicing into a prime steak. It was pink, glistening with juices, the steam rising in fragrant curls of butter and garlic. My portion, however, was a slab of gray, desiccated fiber, its edges curling upward, as if trying to shrink away from the memory of its own decay in the back of a refrigerator. "I hope the seasoning isn't too strong for you, Helen," Claire said without bothering to turn her head. Her voice was as slick as oil, that synthetic sweetness she always used to lacquer her contempt. I didn't answer. I lifted the silver knife, feeling its weight in my skeletal hand, where blue veins mapped my skin like the gnarled roots of an ancient tree. My eyes swept over the plate. To a woman who had spent her lonely widowhood devouring anatomy and pharmacology textbooks, this meat was more than just a leftover. It was a sentence. I detected faint, iridescent shadows on the surface, the telltale sign of lipid oxidation, and the silent colonization of listeria. At 75, my immune system was no longer a fortress. My gastric pepsin levels had plummeted with age. To ingest this tainted protein would trigger a violent, acute enteritis. In their eyes, I was merely senile, and a death by dehydration would be neatly filed away as natural decline. I looked at Andrew. He let out a loud laugh at one of his wife's jokes, that hollow, echoing laugh of those who have climbed the corporate ladder by stepping on the faces of their own kin. He refused to look at me. Perhaps he feared that if he met my clouded eyes, he would see the reflection of a silent executioner. "The seasoning is quite adequate, Claire," I replied, my voice raspy but anchored by a terrifying calm. "But the meat is far too cold. And as you know, at this temperature, the protein structure has denatured. It offers no nutritional value for someone who must maintain a stable blood pressure." Claire froze for a heartbeat. A flicker of suspicion ignited in her gaze. She hadn't expected this demented old woman to speak in the dialect of a surgeon. But she quickly reclaimed her arrogance, taking a slow, triumphant sip of her vintage red wine. I lowered my knife, leaving the meat untouched, and began to observe Andrew. My son was abusing benzodiazepines. I could read it in the uneven constriction of his pupils under the chandelier light and the shallow, staccato rhythm of his breathing. The pressure of his career and Claire's manipulations were eroding him from the inside out. He wasn't the mastermind. He was the weak accomplice, allowing his wife to poison his mother with neglect and those strange brain vitamins every morning. Throughout the dinner, I sat like a ghost at the very table I had once polished with pride. They had pushed my chair to the far end, right in the draft of the kitchen door, where the chill bit into my cervical vertebrae. It was a calculated arrangement. Peripheral hypothermia, subtle but constant, designed to strain an elderly heart. Claire wanted me exhausted, even while I sat to eat. "What's wrong, Mother? Why aren't you eating?" Andrew finally spoke, his eyes still tethered to his phone screen. "I was just wondering, Andrew." I tilted my head, pinning him with my gaze. "Why is your cortisol level, the stress hormone, so high tonight? You seem agitated. Is it because your steak is too hot? Or because your compassion has gone cold?" The room plunged into an absolute, suffocating silence. Only the grandfather clock ticked, rhythmic as the heartbeat of a priest preparing for a ritual. Claire slammed her wine glass down so hard that the red liquid splashed onto the white cloth, looking exactly like a fresh bloodstain. They thought I was oblivious. They believed 2 years in a darkened room, swallowing high-dose sedatives under the guise of vitamins, had blunted this brain. They were wrong. I had secretly ceased the medication 6 months ago. I used my knowledge of pharmacokinetics to understand exactly how much water and clean food I needed to flush the toxins from my system. Every morning, I purged those pills in the silence of the bathroom, feeling the clarity return to my neurons like a cold dawn. True freedom doesn't begin when you escape the house. It begins when your enemy believes they have completely broken you. I think you need to rest, Helen. You're starting to talk nonsense again. Claire stood up, her smile as sharp as a scalpel. She approached me and placed a hand on my shoulder. It was freezing, a coldness that didn't come from the weather, but from the void where a soul should be. I stood up without her help. Though my leg muscles trembled from orthostatic hypotension, I kept my spine as straight as a needle. You're right, Claire. I will sleep very well tonight, because I know one thing for certain. A body poisoned by tainted food can be treated, but a soul rotted by betrayal is a systemic failure with no cure. I turned away, my footsteps slow but deliberate on the hardwood floor. Behind me, I felt Andrew's ragged breath and Claire's searing stare. This was no longer a family dispute. This was a dissection where I would hold the blade to peel back the layers of pretense and the filth of their schemes. My first prescription for them was the truth. The dawn of tomorrow would not be like any other. Helen was no longer a patient for them to practice their cruelty upon. I was the one holding the medical record of my own life. Dinner dissolved into a suffocating silence, the kind of stillness that precedes a storm as static electricity builds in the air. I retreated to my room, an isolated pocket at the end of the hallway, where the scent of damp wood and the weight of solitude were my only companions. Andrew did not see me to my door. He was too engrossed in an investment project with Claire. Their voices drifted from the living room in excited whispers, sounding like snakes slithering over dry leaves. I sank into the old armchair as shadows draped over my bony shoulders. The door creaked open, and Claire stepped in. In her hand was a small tray, carrying a glass of warm water and 2 pale blue pills. "Time for your brain boosters, Mother Helen. The doctor says you need them to keep your mind sharp," she said, punctuating the word sharp with a smirk she didn't bother to hide. The bedside lamp cast a harsh light across her face, highlighting the predatory grin of a hunter watching their prey stumble into a trap. I looked down at the pills. Under the dim amber glow, I recognized the faint imprints and the specific shape of the film coating. These were no vitamins or circulatory supplements. This was a high-dose benzodiazepine, typically reserved for mild anesthesia or the treatment of acute schizophrenic agitation. Claire wanted to induce a state of pseudo-dementia, a fabricated cognitive decline. These pills would suppress my central nervous system, leaving me lethargic, disoriented, and robbed of my ability to articulate speech. If I continued to ingest them, within a month, Andrew would have more than enough evidence to sign the papers committing me to a psychiatric facility with a diagnosis of stage 4 dementia. "My throat feels a bit dry, Claire. Could you bring me a slice of lemon?" I whispered, feigning a ragged breath as if the mere act of speaking had exhausted me. She sighed. a flash of impatience twitching her perfectly groomed eyebrows. "You really are a nuisance. Wait here." The moment her shadow vanished past the door, I moved. I didn't flush the pills. I needed them as evidence for the day of reckoning. I tucked them into a narrow slit beneath the armchair's cushion, my secret vault where I had been hoarding remnants of my life for the past 6 months. In their place, I produced a peppermint candy I had meticulously filed down to the same size and shape and popped it into my mouth. When Claire returned with the lemon, I swallowed the medication, right before her eyes. She stood there, arms folded, waiting. She wanted to witness the poison begin to seep into my bloodstream. "Good. Now sleep. Don't make us worry anymore," she said, her voice like ice. She turned and walked out, not forgetting to lock the door from the outside. The metallic click of the bolt sounded like a blade severing the final thread of my faith in this family. I stood by the window, watching my reflection in the glass. I saw a woman with silver hair and age spots, but her eyes held a fire that Claire and Andrew could never have imagined. I began the exercises for what I called the race against paralysis. Even without tonight's dose, the remnants of previous months' medication still lingered in my adipose tissue. I had to keep the blood moving. I began massaging the pressure points in my palms and beneath my jaw to stimulate the parasympathetic nervous system, fighting off the physiological drowsiness that threatened to pull me under. A while later, footsteps echoed in the hallway. Not one pair, but 2. "Did you sign the papers?" Claire's voice was low but razor sharp. I'm still worried. She is my mother, after all." Andrew's voice trembled. My poor, pathetic boy. His weakness was the most lethal weapon Claire possessed. "Your mother. She's obstructing our future. This house, Thomas's insurance. Are you going to let it all rot away with that old woman? Look at her. She's already lost her mind." What she said at dinner tonight is proof enough. We need to move her before she does something truly insane. I pressed my ear to the door, my heart hammering against my ribs. My pulse must have been hitting 110 beats per minute. A dull angina began to ache in my chest as adrenaline flooded my system. I took a deep, diaphragmatic breath to slow my heart, ensuring my brain remained oxygenated through the surge of emotion. I had to hear this. I had to live to bear witness. "But if the doctors check?" Andrew stammered. "What doctors?" "The psychiatrist I've arranged is a close friend of my cousin. With the amount of medication she accidentally takes every day, no test in the world can prove she's lucid. Tomorrow, we start the paperwork." The footsteps faded into the distance. I stood frozen in the dark. This betrayal was no longer about cold meat or a callous attitude. This was an assassination of my existence. They didn't want me dead immediately that would trigger a forensic inquiry. They wanted me brain dead in a remote nursing home, where I would slowly wither away while they spent my money on expensive red wine and luxury penthouses. I returned to the armchair and pulled out Thomas's old anatomy book. Tucked inside were the pharmacy receipts I had scavenged from Claire's trash. I recorded everything: the drug names, the dosages, and the physical reactions I had been forced to mimic to deceive them. People say old age is the sunset of life, but for me, this sunset wasn't a peaceful violet. It was the color of blood and vengeance. Thomas used to tell me that medicine was meant to save people, but tonight, medicine was my only weapon to punish those who had lost their humanity. Andrew, My son, the child who used to sob if I so much as nicked my finger in the kitchen, was now standing by while his wife held the knife to cut the cord between mother and child. Evil is not an innate disease. It is a virus that enters hollow and decayed souls. I lay down on the bed, but I didn't close my eyes. I listened to my heartbeat, feeling the resolve in the muscles I had secretly trained every night. I was no longer the weak Helen being led by her children. I was an observer, performing a silent autopsy on this very house. Tomorrow, they would bring the doctor. They would expect to see a lethargic old woman, slack-jawed and vacant-eyed. I would give them exactly what they wanted to see, but beneath that mask, I would be recording every face, every word of that corrupted physician. My second prescription was ready: patience. I would wait until they were at their most confident, until they thought victory was firmly in their grasp. That would be the moment I injected the truth into the veins of their lives. Outside, the pale moonlight bled through the window, casting shadows of skeletal branches against the wall like demonic hands. I smiled, not a smile of joy, but one that signaled the beginning of a purge. Tonight, Helen would sleep, but the silent head nurse within me had finally awakened. That night, after the echoes of Claire and Andrew's footsteps had finally died away behind the doors of their opulent suite, I remained motionless in the darkness. This room, once a cluttered storage space before they generously cleared it for my arrival, reeked of silent decay. I reached out and flicked on the old desk lamp, its jaundiced light dancing across stacks of unopened cardboard boxes. At the bottom of a dust-caked bin, I found it, a leather-bound volume, frayed and worn, its spine cracked, yet still radiating the warmth of pristine memories. Thomas's Principles of Anatomy and Physiology. Thomas, my husband, was a surgeon with gifted hands and a heart so sensitive I often wondered if he truly belonged in this brutal world. When he was alive, I lived in the shadow of his brilliance, tending to every meal and garment for Andrew. But every night, once our son was deep in sleep, Thomas would sit beside me, turning these very pages, explaining the miracles of the human body. "Helen," he would say, his voice as deep and comforting as a cello, "the human body is the most honest system on earth. It doesn't know how to lie. If there is betrayal, the cells will scream. If there is pain, the heartbeat will record it." My trembling fingers traced the meticulously drawn diagrams of the circulatory system. I stopped at the chapter on the central nervous system. Thomas's notations in blue ink remained vivid. GABA receptor inhibitors can dim the will, but the survival instinct is something no drug can erase. He could never have known that decades later, these scribbles would become his wife's lifeline. Claire and Andrew were attempting to weaponize medical knowledge to turn me into a husk, forgetting that I had been tutored by a master. A surge of adrenaline hit me as I discovered an envelope tucked deep between the pages. It was Thomas's original will, a copy I thought I had lost long ago. In his steady hand, he had written, "The house and all savings shall remain in Helen's possession until the end of her life. Andrew shall inherit only upon his mother's passing or her voluntary renunciation." A bitter lump formed in my throat. Andrew knew. He knew his father's dying wish, yet he allowed Claire to steer him, attempting to brand me as legally incapacitated just to seize the house sooner. The next morning, harsh sunlight pierced through the curtains. stabbing at my temples. I heard Claire barking orders at the maid in the living room, followed by Andrew's heated voice on the phone, arguing over a failing contract. I stepped out of my room slowly, deliberately dragging my feet to mimic the classic signs of drug-induced ataxia, unsteady, stumbling, and devoid of balance. "What are you doing out here? Why aren't you resting?" Andrew snapped when he saw me. He looked pathetic, with dark hollows beneath his eyes and disheveled hair. I wanted some air. I wheezed, my eyes vacant, staring into nothingness. Claire emerged from the kitchen, clutching a sheaf of documents. Perfect timing. "Andrew, Lawyer Thompson sent over the power of attorney. Just get her to sign this, and we're done. We need the cash to cover the company's deficit, or the bank will foreclose on this house too." I leaned against the wall, feeling the chill of the stone seep into my back. The tension reached its peak as Andrew took a pen and stepped toward me. He didn't look into my eyes. He looked at a point just above my shoulder. "Mom, my company is in trouble. Claire is right. You should let us manage the assets for you. You're forgetful now, and frail. Holding on to these papers is just an extra burden." I looked at the son I had sacrificed my youth to raise. I wanted to scream, to slap that pale, cowardly face. But Thomas had taught me, the best surgeon is the one who maintains absolute stillness before making the decisive cut. I observed Andrew closely. As he lied, his prefrontal cortex was clearly overloaded, rendering him unable to maintain eye contact. His hand gave a slight tremor, a classic anxiety-induced tremor. He was terrified. Was he afraid of me? Or of his own cowardice? "Let me see it first." I reached out a shaky hand to take the papers. "What do you know about it?" Claire hissed, snatching the documents back. "Just sign it and be done. Don't make us use stronger measures." "Stronger measures?" I looked up at her. For a split second, the vacancy vanished, replaced by a gaze so sharp it forced Claire to recoil a step. But I quickly retracted that edge, dissolving back into frailty. "You mean putting me in a nursing home?" Andrew flinched. "Claire, stop it. Mom, just sign. I promise I'll take care of you." I gripped the pen with weak fingers. In my mind, Thomas's book flipped open again. I remembered the chapter on pharmacology, on how to mimic a seizure without detection. If I signed now, I would lose everything. I needed more time to find out who Claire's close friend, doctor, was. I feel so dizzy. I let my body collapse toward the floor as naturally as possible. I didn't just fall. I lowered my center of gravity and stiffened the muscles in my neck and arms, perfectly mimicking a mild grand mal seizure. I rolled my eyes back, letting a bit of saliva pool at the corners of my mouth. "Mom! Mom!" Andrew screamed, rushing to catch me. The terror in his voice was real. At least the human part of him wasn't entirely dead yet. "Don't touch her. Leave her flat," Claire barked, though her face had turned ashen. Maybe last night's dose was too strong. Lying on the cold floor, I listened to their panic. Claire was terrified I would die right now. Before the papers were signed, and Andrew, he was crying, the weeping of a weakling. In the darkness of my feigned convulsion, I felt Thomas smiling at me. His anatomy book hadn't just taught me about bone and blood. It had taught me about the cruelty of those who act in the name of love. Claire and Andrew were playing a game with my life, but they had no idea that I was the one holding the scalpel. My life was like a complex surgery gone wrong. Thomas was no longer here to stop the bleeding, so I had to stitch my own wounds. Those blue pills, that tainted meat, and this power of attorney. They were all foreign bodies I had to excise. "Call an ambulance," Andrew yelled. "No. If you call an ambulance, the police will get involved because of her medication records. Call Dr. Miller now," Claire growled. Miller. I had the name. The accomplice. I slowly regained consciousness, gasping for air, looking at them with feigned, tearful eyes. "What? What happened to me?" "Andrew, save me!" Andrew held me, his shoulders shaking. Claire stood with her arms folded by the door, her eyes cold as a serpent recalculating its path after a missed strike. I was carried back to my room. Thomas's anatomy book lay silent under the bed once more. It had fulfilled its mission for the night. My third prescription had been filled. Chaos. When the enemy panics, the cracks in their plan finally begin to show. Andrew, Claire, I will. Your feast has only just begun. And this time, I will be the one serving the courses. The feigned seizure from the night before had granted me a luxury I hadn't tasted in months. Silence. I lay in my room. The door no longer bolted from the outside, perhaps because Claire feared that if I died suddenly in a locked room, the authorities would find probable cause for a forensic autopsy. But this quiet was not peace. It was the heavy stillness between two breaths of a predator recalibrating its tactics. Andrew had left for work early. I heard his engine roar and then vanish, leaving the house to two women and the ghosts of a festering hatred. Claire entered my room at 10 o'clock sharp, carrying a teacup of chamomile that sent plumes of steam curling into the air. She was draped in cream silk, her makeup as flawless as if she were heading to a charity gala, rather than overseeing the slow internment of her mother-in-law. "How are you feeling, Mother?" she asked, her voice so cloyingly sweet it made my stomach churn. She set the tea on the bedside table and sat on the edge of my mattress. It was a characteristic move. Claire always invaded personal space to exert a silent, suffocating dominance. I looked deep into her vibrant blue eyes and saw only a vast, chilling emptiness. I recognized my enemy then, a classic case of narcissistic personality disorder. To her, people were not sentient beings but mere objects to serve her grandiosity. Andrew was a financial tool. I was a domestic obstacle to be excised. Narcissists like her lack empathy. Their prefrontal cortex doesn't resonate with the suffering of others. When she smiled, it was a hollow mimicry of emotion, not the thing itself. "I'm all right. Just a bit weak," I wheezed, letting my eyes wander with feigned lethargy. "Drink your tea, Mother. I brewed it myself to help stabilize your nerves after that episode last night." I watched the steam rise. The scent of chamomile was unnaturally thick, a fragrant shroud intended to mask something bitter. I reached for the cup, my hand trembling so much that the liquid splashed over the rim. "You made this yourself? How rare," I murmured. "Because I worry about you." She smiled, but the warmth never reached her eyes. "You know, Andrew is under immense pressure. He cried all night, terrified he'd lose you. If you truly love him, you should sign those papers soon. It's the only way to lift the burden off your son's shoulders." She was deploying the ultimate weapon of the narcissist: gaslighting. She wanted me to believe that I was the source of my son's agony, that my very existence was a parasite, and that my signature, my surrender, was his only salvation. "I know Andrew is struggling," I said, my lips brushing the rim of the cup, but I ensured not a single drop entered my mouth. The moment the liquid touched my tongue, I felt it, a sharp, metallic tang. It wasn't the bitterness of tea, it was the unmistakable edge of digoxin, a high-potency cardiac glycoside. In the right hands, it saves lives. In the wrong hands, given to an elderly woman with slow renal clearance, it triggers digitalis toxicity. First comes the confusion, then the xanthopsia, where the world is veiled in yellow halos, and finally, a sudden cardiac arrest that leaves behind almost no trace unless one knows exactly where to look. "Won't you drink?" Claire urged, her hand clamping down on mine with threatening force. I set the cup back down, using the heat as an excuse. "Claire, do you remember Thomas?" She stiffened, her eyes narrowing into slits. "My father-in-law? Why bring him up now?" "Thomas once told me that a woman's beauty isn't in her makeup, but in the integrity of her gaze. He always said, 'You were beautiful, Claire.'" It was a strike aimed at her vanity. A narcissist craves adulation like oxygen. Her face softened slightly, a flash of unmistakable pride illuminating her features. "Father always had an eye for quality. But Thomas was also a brilliant surgeon," I continued, my voice dropping into a hollow, feigned nostalgia. "He taught me how to recognize a heart that is withering. You know, when someone lies, their heart rate doesn't just accelerate. The capillaries in the neck dilate slightly." "You're sweating at the temples, Claire. Are you unwell?" The mask disintegrated instantly. The demure daughter-in-law vanished, replaced by something feral. She lurched to her feet, sweeping the teacup off the table. Porcelain shattered against the floor, and the tea, that colorless poison, soaked deep into the expensive rug. "Stop that psychotic rambling," she hissed through clenched teeth. "Who do you think you are? A doctor? You're just a senile old hag rotting away in this room. Do you think Andrew will believe you? He belongs to me. This house belongs to me." She lunged forward, gripping my shoulders and shaking me with such violence that the pain in my aged joints spiked into my brain. I didn't cry out. I simply looked at her and offered a pale, ghostly smile. "The house may belong to you, Claire, but his soul does not. You are turning him into a murderer. Do you know the penalty for poisoning one's own mother?" She slapped me a sharp, stinging strike that burst the skin. The salty taste of blood spread across my tongue. "Poisoning? Who could prove it? You took the wrong pills. You fell down the stairs. You lost your mind. There are 1,000 ways for a 75-year-old to go. Andrew will cry for a day, and then he'll be just fine when he sees the bank balance." She turned and stormed out, leaving me with a throbbing cheek and the wreckage on the floor. But she didn't know that tucked beneath the bed, a tiny tape recorder, a relic of Thomas's that I had secretly repaired, had captured every word of her confession. I sat in the shadows, my hand resting on the heat of my bruised face. The physical pain was nothing compared to the agony of watching my son be molded into a monster. Claire didn't just want the assets. She wanted to hollow out Andrew's humanity until he was entirely under her thumb. Medicine calls it a personality disorder. I call it a rot of the soul. Thomas taught me how to excise a malignancy. You must cut deep into the healthy tissue to ensure no cancer remains. Claire was the tumor in my family. I leaned down and picked up a shard of the broken teacup. Its edge was as sharp as a scalpel. My fourth prescription for Claire was ready. Arrogance. Narcissists always believe they are the smartest in the room, and that is their fatal flaw. She thought she won because she struck me. She didn't know that every act of cruelty was being meticulously recorded in a medical chart. That, on the day of judgment, she would be forced to sign. Andrew, my son, I will save you from this darkness, even if the price is the total destruction of the family I spent a lifetime building. Tonight, I will not sleep. I will learn how to treat a tumor without the mercy of anesthesia. The following morning, the house was submerged in a thick, stifling atmosphere, the kind of pre-storm barometric pressure that I could feel vibrating in my very marrow. Claire's slap from the day before had blossomed into a vivid purple hematoma on my left cheek. But strangely, it throbbed less than Andrew's silence. My son, the boy I once sat with through endless nights when his fevers ran high, was now sitting across from me in the living room, his eyes tethered to the legal documents Claire had meticulously fanned out on the table. Mom, about last night. Claire said you fell and were delirious, Andrew began. His voice was muddy, a murky sound from a man who refused to lift his gaze. I sat in my wheelchair, my skeletal hands interlaced. I didn't look at his face. I looked at his perfectly pressed shirt collar, the handiwork of a maid he hired to replace the care of a mother. Do you believe her? Or do you believe the bruises on my face, Andrew? I asked. My voice was so steady it surprised even me. Andrew flinched. I could see his chest heaving in an irregular rhythm. According to Thomas's old texts, the autonomic nervous system undergoes a violent upheaval when a human confronts a profound moral conflict. Andrew was experiencing a systemic collapse. The capillaries on his neck began to flush a deep crimson, a peripheral vasoconstriction triggered by a surge of noradrenaline. His heartbeat, though I wasn't touching him, betrayed itself through the visible, rapid thrumming of the carotid artery in his neck. It was racing, likely at 120 beats per minute. His heart was screaming at the lie. But his will had been shackled by Claire. Stop making this so difficult for me. Andrew suddenly erupted, slamming his hand onto the table. The company is on the brink of bankruptcy. Claire is right. You holding on to this house, and the savings serves no purpose. You're old, Mom. You need professional care. In a high-end nursing home, you'll have doctors, friends. A high-end nursing home? Or a psychiatric ward under the thumb of Dr. Miller, your wife's little friend? I cut him off, my voice as cold and precise as a scalpel slicing through a fog of pretense. Andrew turned ashen. He glanced at Claire as she stepped out of the kitchen. She watched me with the unblinking eyes of a cobra, observing its prey's final, futile struggles. See, Andrew? She's spiraling into her delusions again, Claire said nonchalantly, her hand coming to rest on Andrew's shoulder like a claim of ownership. Mother Helen, Dr. Miller is a leading psychiatric expert. He's only here today to help stabilize you. At that moment, the doorbell chimed. A middle-aged man with wire-rimmed glasses and a manufactured, industrial smile entered. Dr. Miller. He carried the scent of a hospital, that sharp, sterile sting of alcohol, and the coldness of medical sentences written in exchange for cash. Hello, Helen. I hear you've been experiencing frequent hallucinations and seizures lately, Miller said, unzipping his bag to produce a stethoscope. He approached me. I caught the scent of his breath, heavy with tobacco and an insufferable arrogance. He pressed the cold diaphragm of the stethoscope to my chest. Heart rate is elevated. Clear signs of generalized anxiety disorder coupled with geriatric cognitive decline, he declared flatly, without checking a single other vital sign. I looked directly into Miller's eyes, then back at Andrew, who stood trembling in the corner of the room. "Dr. Miller," I said, my voice ringing clear in the sudden vacuum of the room. "Are you listening to my heart, or the sound of your own rotting conscience? According to your diagnosis, I am senile. How then do you explain that I vividly remember the concentration of digoxin in the tea Claire brewed for me yesterday morning? Or the fact that you received $50,000 from Andrew's joint account to sign this mental competency evaluation?" The room froze. Miller recoiled, his eyes darting frantically behind his lenses. Claire lunged forward, snatching the stethoscope from Miller's hand. "You senile old hag, what kind of nonsense are you spewing?" "It isn't nonsense, Claire. I have proof," I said, pulling the small tape recorder from my pocket. "Everything you said yesterday, about my fall, about the plan to erase me, it's all in here." Andrew lunged, not to protect me, but to seize the recorder. As his skin brushed mine, I felt the heat of his flesh, the fever of a profound shame. I saw his eyes, bloodshot and frantic, and the distended forehead veins telltale markers of intracranial pressure rising from a cocktail of rage and absolute terror. "Mom, give that to me," Andrew roared. I let go. The recorder hit the floor, but before Andrew could reach it, Claire's sharp heel ground it into the wood. The sound of shattering plastic was dry and final. Claire erupted into a laugh, the jagged, manic laughter of a victor. "Proof! Now it's gone! Miller, sign the papers. She needs to be moved immediately." I looked at Andrew. He stood there, staring at the wreckage beneath his wife's feet, then at me. I saw a single tear track down his cheek. But it wasn't a tear of remorse. It was the tear of a coward who had just shed the final heavy burden of his morality. "I'm sorry, Mom. I have no other way," Andrew whispered, the words choking in his throat. In that moment, I realized a truth more painful than death. The betrayal of one's own flesh is not a knife in the back. It is the act of standing by and watching your mother's execution without lifting a finger. Andrew's heart might be fast, it might be disordered by fear, but it didn't vibrate with a single shred of love. Thomas was wrong. The human body isn't always honest. Andrew had a biologically healthy heart, but his soul had been clinically dead for a long time. I didn't resist as Miller injected a needle into my deltoid. I knew the cold burn of haloperidol, a potent neuroleptic designed to paralyze the motor system. "Good night, Mother Helen," Claire whispered in my ear as the drug began its slow, heavy march through my veins, pulling my eyelids down like lead weights. But as the darkness surged inward, I felt no fear. Claire thought she had destroyed the only evidence. She forgot one thing. A head nurse and the widow of a surgeon always has a contingency plan for the worst-case scenario. That recorder was merely bait. The original recording had been sent out at dawn via the only courier I still trusted, the neighborhood paperboy. My fifth prescription for Andrew was simple: emptiness. He thought that by casting me out, he would gain the house. But all he would inherit was a hollow tomb of filial love, where every footstep in these halls would remind him of exactly how much he sold his mother for. The blackout hit, total and ink black. But I knew that when I woke up, the real surgery would finally begin. and this time I wouldn't be using any anesthesia. Miller's injection didn't just cast me into darkness. It turned my body into a mass of liquefying jelly. When I finally drifted awake, the room was bathed in a sunset, so crimson it looked like spilled blood. My head felt like a lead weight, and every time I attempted to lift an arm, my muscles revolted with uncontrollable tremors. I had been discarded, left entirely alone. Andrew and Claire were likely celebrating their victory with a lavish dinner. Or perhaps they were busy scrubbing away the remnants of my presence in preparation for the ambulance scheduled for dawn. I had to get off this bed. I needed to verify if the backup recording had reached its destination, and more urgently, I needed a way to neutralize the haloperidol currently coursing through my veins. I pressed my palms against the mattress, straining to push my torso upright. Instantly, a violent wave of vertigo crashed over me. The room spun in a sickening whirlpool, and shadows closed in from my temples, as if someone had suddenly drained every drop of blood from my brain. This was orthostatic hypotension, the classic, brutal side effect of combining high-dose sedatives with the dehydration Claire had carefully orchestrated. As I sat up, gravity won the battle. My aged heart lacked the contractile force to pump blood upward to my cerebrum. The baroreceptors in my carotid arteries had been paralyzed by the drugs, unable to signal for the necessary vasoconstriction. If I fell now, my femur would snap like dry kindling, and that would be the end. Not yet, I hissed through clenched teeth, cold sweat drenching me in an instant. I didn't try to stand. I employed the technique Thomas had once demonstrated. I began to pump my toes and flex my calf muscles, creating a manual muscle pump to force venous blood back toward my heart. I breathed deeply, one rhythmic inhale at a time, to maintain intrathoracic pressure. I slid off the bed and onto the floor. The biting chill of the stone against my skin acted like a splash of cold water, sharpening my focus. I didn't walk. I crawled. I dragged myself like a wounded animal. Inch by agonized inch, toward the old wooden cabinet where I had hidden a bottle of water and several small packets of salt. Claire's laughter drifted from downstairs, piercing through the door. "See, Andrew? Everything is falling into place. Tomorrow she'll be in the best possible care. We finally get our lives back." Our lives. Andrew's voice was a low mumble, sounding like the ghost of a man who had just finished signing away his soul. I reached the door, my hand brushing the hallway rug. At that exact moment, the door swung open. Claire stood there, clutching a black trash bag. She froze when she saw me sprawled on the floor, my hand still straining toward the cabinet. "Oh, look at this. Our dear mother Helen is learning to crawl," she sneered. She stepped forward and ground the sharp point of her stiletto heel into my frail hand. "Where do you think you're going? Looking for that shattered recorder? Or trying to crawl out and beg the neighbors for help?" The agony from my knuckles spiked straight to my heart, but I didn't cry out. I looked up at her, my eyes blazing even as my body withered. "Do you think you've won, Claire?" I rasped, the salty tang of blood spreading from the corner of my lip. "I don't think. I know," she whispered. She reached down, grabbed a handful of my hair, and yanked my head back, forcing me to stare into the depths of her malice. "Tomorrow morning, the private ambulance arrives. Dr. Miller has signed the evaluation. You'll be diagnosed with progressive dementia and paroxysmal delusions. No one believes a crazy old woman, Helen. No one. As she wrenched my hair, I felt the tightening of the sternocleidomastoid muscle in my neck. I used the momentum of her pull to pivot. My other hand, instead of resisting, had secretly closed around a small shard of glass from yesterday's broken teacup, which I had palmed while crawling across the floor. I didn't stab her. I only needed a distraction. Using every ounce of my remaining strength, I bit down hard on the back of the hand that held my hair. Ah! Claire shrieked, recoiling. She stared at the deep teeth marks on her flesh, then at me with utter revulsion. "You senile animal! You dared to bite me?" She pulled back her foot, aiming a kick at my ribs. But Andrew suddenly appeared in the doorway. "Claire, what are you doing?" Andrew yelled, rushing over to pull his wife away. His face turned ghostly white when he saw me curled on the floor, my breath coming in ragged hitches. "Look at her! She attacked me!" "She's truly lost it, Andrew!" Claire screamed, thrusting her bleeding hand toward him. Andrew looked at me, then at Claire. For a fleeting second, I saw a violent oscillation in his eyes. The conflict between his vestigial humanity and his ravenous greed was performing a brutal autopsy on his soul. "Mom." Andrew knelt beside me, his hand trembling as he reached for my shoulder. "Don't touch me." I pushed his hand away, my voice weak but carrying the undeniable authority of a mother. "You chose Claire. You chose the money. Stop pretending to be decent. Your heartbeat may lie, but your cowardice is written in every fiber of your being." I looked directly at him, clinging to my last shred of lucidity before the hypotension pulled me back down. "Do you know why I could still crawl this far? Because my heart, as old as it is, contains no betrayal. But you, Andrew, you're standing tall on your feet, yet inside, you've been paralyzed for a long time." Claire hauled Andrew up. "Enough! Stop listening to her manipulations. Leave her here. By tomorrow morning, it will all be over." They left, the bolt clicking shut once more. I lay there on the cold floor, watching their shadows fade. I took a deep breath. The toxins were still there, but my rage had ignited the sympathetic nervous system, surging my adrenaline and stabilizing my blood pressure just enough. I crawled to the cabinet, grabbed the water, and drank it all. Water was life. Water would help my kidneys filter out the filth Miller had injected into me. Thomas once said, "Gravity is the enemy of the elderly." But ingratitude is the enemy of life itself. Claire thought that by pinning me to the floor, she could strip me of my dignity. She didn't know that once a woman has crawled through the agony of betrayal, no drug, no drop in blood pressure can stop her from rising again. "Andrew, you saw your mother crawling on this floor. That image will haunt you for the rest of your days. Every time you walk through these halls, you will remember the shadow of a frail woman dragging herself through the dark because of your cowardice. Tonight is the last night I spend in this house, but I do not leave as the defeated. I leave to prepare for a total offensive. The backup recording is likely already in the hands of the private investigator Thomas once helped years ago. My sixth prescription for them both was simple: haunting. Claire has the scar on her hand to remember me by, and Andrew has the scar on his heart. Dawn is approaching, and I, Helen, will rise with the very hands that once cradled the son who betrayed me. This time, I will stand firm, not because of blood pressure, but because of the pressure of justice boiling in my veins. The door bolted shut behind Andrew and Claire, but my mind was a wide-open map of strategic retaliation. The haloperidol that Miller had forced into my system was already being flushed out, neutralized by the gallons of pure water I had consumed in secret. I sat in the darkness, feeling the familiar precision returning to my fingers. My children thought they were the masters of this game. They forgot that 50 years as a surgeon's wife and a lifelong student of medicine had taught me how to transform a prison cell into a silent, functioning laboratory. I reached beneath the bed and pulled out a small satchel containing the items I had spent a week scavenging: 3 sterilized glass vials, several cotton swabs, and a needleless plastic syringe recovered from Claire's medical waste. The human body is a perfect archive of evidence. Everything Claire forced down my throat, every toxin Miller injected into my veins, they all left a molecular trail. My kidneys were working overtime to filter them, and my own biological waste would become the most damning testimony. I had performed a sample collection in the solitude of my room. These fluids, once analyzed by an independent lab, would reveal sedative concentrations 5 times the legal limit. At dawn, the sharp click of Claire's heels echoed down the hallway. She wasn't alone. I heard her stifled giggles as she spoke to Andrew. "See, Andrew? Dr. Miller said just one final signature stating she is incontinent and incapable of self-care and will have total control. No more waiting." The door swung open. Claire entered with a mask of performative concern, followed by Andrew, whose face was as ashen as a burnt-out hearth. In Claire's hands was a bowl of steaming soup, but the scent that wafted from it sent a cold shiver down my spine. "Mother Helen, you seem much more lucid today," Claire said, setting the bowl on the bedside table. "Eat some soup. I had the chef prepare this specifically for you." I looked at the broth. The oily droplets shimmering on the surface were unnatural. "What did you put in this, Claire?" I asked, my voice so level that Claire visibly recoiled. "What are you talking about?" "It's just chicken soup." I picked up the silver spoon and stirred slowly. "Chicken? Or a dash of chloral hydrate? It has a faint scent of rotting pears, Claire. You tried to mask it with too much black pepper, but you forgot that an elderly person's sense of smell becomes hyperacute to foreign chemicals when their life depends on it." Claire's face cycled through shades of white, green, and a frantic red. She looked to Andrew for support, but he remained anchored to the floor, his head bowed. You really are insane," Claire shrieked. "Andrew, do you see? She's obsessed with being poisoned." I smiled a cold, knowing smile that forced them both back a step. I stood up from my wheelchair. Though my legs were still trembling, I held my ground with the full weight of the truth. "Andrew, do you want to know what your wife has been doing to me?" I pulled a glass vial from my pocket, filled with the liquid I had preserved. "In here isn't just sedatives. There is evidence that Claire swapped my heart medication for high-dose diuretics to induce dehydration and systemic exhaustion. You're a businessman, Andrew. Do you have any idea how much higher the cost of bribing Dr. Miller is compared to letting me live in peace?" Claire lunged to snatch the vial, but I was faster. I stepped back and hurled the bowl of soup onto the white rug beneath her feet. Look. I pointed at the soup as it began to foam slightly against the synthetic fibers. A chemical reaction with the rug's polymers. If I had swallowed this, my stomach lining would have suffered an immediate hemorrhage. Is that how you wanted me to go? A painful death disguised as a domestic accident? Andrew stared at the bubbling stain on the carpet, then at Claire. For the first time, a look of unadulterated revulsion twisted his features. He looked at his wife as if she were a monster he had never met. Claire, you said we were just taking her to rest? Andrew whispered. Shut up! You wanted the money too, didn't you? You wanted this house, Claire roared, the last of her beautiful facade shattering into jagged pieces. Her face was distorted with rage and terror. This old hag has to go, or we lose everything. I stood amidst the wreckage of their cruelty. I felt my heart pounding, not from fear, but from the surge of the sympathetic nervous system facing down an enemy. Do you think I am a specimen in your laboratory? I stepped toward Andrew and placed a withered hand on his chest. Your heart is racing, Andrew. That is the rhythm of a coward. I have performed an experiment on myself to see how much of your love for me remained. The results are back. 0%. I pulled out one final item. A copy of a blood analysis I had secretly sent out 2 days ago via the paperboy. A private investigator, a former patient of Thomas, had facilitated the lab work. Dr. Miller can sign all the fake evaluations he wants, but the biochemistry in this report doesn't lie. The toxin levels in my blood have exceeded lethal thresholds. If you do not stop this right now, this report goes directly to the medical board and the police. Claire turned deathly pale. Miller had assured her I was isolated from the world. She never expected the senile woman she kept under lock and key to be operating a sophisticated network of investigators and lab tests. Thomas always said that medicine wasn't just about healing. It was about finding the truth behind the symptoms. Tonight, I was no longer a grieving mother. I was a soul surgeon, dissecting the rot within my own son. Andrew stood motionless. The truth was a high-voltage current running through him, paralyzing his self-delusion. He saw the papers on the table, his trembling wife, and his mother, the woman he thought was lost to madness, standing before him like a supreme judge. Mom, don't say a word, Andrew. Your words are just medical white noise I no longer care to hear, I said, turning my back on him with clinical coldness. Your prescription for tonight is simple: the truth. Sit there and watch that stain on the rug eat away at the last of our trust. I returned to my bed and closed my eyes. I knew no ambulance would be coming tomorrow. Claire knew that if she moved against me now, she would be the first one in a prison cell. My 7th prescription had taken hold. Fear. When a predator begins to fear their victim, their power structure collapses. Outside, the wind hissed through the window cracks like the screams of lost souls. I smiled. My experiment was a success, even if the result was the total disintegration of my family. I would rather a truthful destruction than a false union built on poison and lies. Tomorrow, I will rise, not to crawl, but to walk out of this house with the stature of a woman who reclaimed her life from the hands of death, death with the faces of those she loved. Following the harrowing experiment of the poisoned soup, the house fell into an unnatural stillness. It was a deathly quiet, reminiscent of the heavy atmosphere in a post-operative ward just before a patient develops catastrophic complications. Claire no longer stormed into my room to mock me. Andrew had vanished into his study. They feared me, or more accurately, they feared the secrets I now held like a hidden blade. I sat by the window, Thomas's book resting on my lap. I wasn't reading, I was listening. I listened to the skeletal creaks of the house I had spent half a lifetime building, a structure now rotting from the inside out due to the fungal growth of greed. My silence was not a surrender. It was a clinical tactic. Sensory deprivation. When you cease to react, the enemy begins to hallucinate. Claire's nervous system was in a state of chronic hyperarousal. Every groan of the floorboards, every rhythmic breath I took, made her flinch. Through the crack in my door, I watched her pace the hallway, her fingernails bitten to the quick, her eyes darting like a cornered animal. She was spiraling into a prolonged psychological crisis, where sustained high cortisol levels began to dissolve her capacity for sound judgment. Phase 2 of my plan began. Reclaiming the title to my life. Monday morning, I shed the skin of the frail invalid. I bathed, dressed in my most formal black velvet gown, and pinned my hair back with surgical precision. I descended the stairs, the rhythmic thud of my cane against the stone floor sounding as steady and authoritative as the heartbeat of a judge. Andrew and Claire were huddled at the dining table with lawyer Thompson, the man I knew had been paid to notarize a forgery. "Mom, why are you down here?" Andrew stammered, his face hollow and gray. I didn't answer. I walked to the head of the table, the seat where Thomas had always presided, and seated myself with agonizing slowness. I placed a weathered blue folder on the table. "Lawyer Thompson," I said, my voice deep and resonant, "I understand you are here to settle the matter of the Miller estate's power of attorney." Thompson adjusted his glasses, beads of sweat breaking across his brow. "Yes, well, Mrs. Miller, Andrew mentioned you weren't well, so—" "I am perfectly well," I interjected, my eyes boring into his. "Well enough to recognize that the signature on the will you intend to file is a clumsy simulation born of agraphia." Thomas was a surgeon. Even in his final hours, his hands maintained an exquisite mechanical control. The signature in the original document I hold here is a world apart from the scrap of paper in your hand. Claire slammed her hands on the table. "You crazy old hag. Where did you get an original?" Andrew said. "His father destroyed it." "Andrew lied to you, Claire." I smiled. A cold, clinical expression. Or rather, Thomas anticipated his son's spinelessness and placed the original in a medical trust you could never touch. I turned to Andrew. "Do you know why I have been silent for 3 days, my son?" "I was awaiting confirmation from the bank regarding the clandestine mortgage you took out on this house to keep your failing company afloat. That is financial fraud. And Claire, bribing Dr. Miller to falsify medical records, is poisoning and attempted murder." The room plunged into a cavernous silence. Thompson scrambled to gather his papers, his voice cracking. I think we need to reassess. I wasn't aware of these complications." He fled the house like a rat scurrying from the light. Only the 3 of us remained. Andrew collapsed into his chair, sobbing into his hands like a broken child. But Claire, her eyes were manic. She lunged across the table, her hands clawing for my throat. "You should be dead. Without you, everything would be mine." I didn't flinch. When her hands were inches from my skin, I spoke softly. "The police are at the gate, Claire, and the hidden camera in that vase has recorded this entire assault. Do you want to know the heart rate of a prisoner? I'd guess you're hitting Vitosh, that threshold where the heart finally shatters from pure terror. Claire froze. She looked at the vase, then toward the window where the rhythmic red and blue lights began to pulse against the walls. Her narcissistic armor crumbled. She sank to the floor, her body seized by a genuine fit of hyperventilation, gasping for air that would no longer sustain her lies. I looked at Andrew. He was a shell of a man. "Mom, please, don't do this to me." "I am doing nothing, Andrew. I am simply returning to you what you discarded, the truth. You tried to manage this house with poison. I will manage it with the law. In medicine, when a limb is gangrenous, the surgeon must amputate to save the life. Andrew, you were that necrotic limb in my life. I tried to heal you with love and endurance, but the toxins had reached the very marrow of your bones. Reclaiming this house isn't about shelter. It is about protecting Thomas's shrine, the last place where memories remain untainted. I will not allow your deceit to pollute it for another second." My 8th prescription. Deprivation. I stripped Claire of her false confidence and Andrew of his cowardly refuge. "Leave," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "Exit this house before I change my mind and hand the detective the evidence of that chicken soup from the other night." They shuffled out into the cold. Claire was still wheezing, leaning on Andrew as they retreated like defeated soldiers under a scorched earth policy of justice. I sat alone in the vastness of the living room. The house felt incredibly large. Breathing again. The prescription of silence was complete. I had reclaimed the brick, the mortar, and the oak, but I knew I had permanently lost a son. Yet, as Thomas once taught me, sometimes we must accept biological loss in exchange for the survival of human dignity. Tonight, I will sleep in the master suite. I will throw the windows wide to let the wind scour away the scent of alcohol, medicine, and betrayal. Tomorrow's dawn belongs to Helen Miller, a woman who didn't just survive an illness, but survived the darkness of the human heart. The house felt cavernously empty after Andrew and Claire's departure. The silence no longer carried a threat. It was a necessary sterile field for me to perform the final stage of this autopsy of truth. I sat in Thomas's study, the desk lamp casting a concentrated pool of light over the medical files that Dr. Miller had hastily discarded into the biohazard waste before his flight. There were no arguments tonight. No scent of charred steak. Only me and the cold, clinical data on the page. The only honest language left in this house. I cross-referenced the original blood work retrieved by the private investigator from the central lab where Miller had conspired to swap the results. The metrics rose from the paper like surgical blades, dissecting their depravity. My bun blood urea, nitrogen, and creatinine levels had spiked alarmingly 3 weeks prior. This was the smoking gun. I was never suffering from natural, senile confusion. It was the hallmark of acute renal distress triggered by prolonged toxicity. Claire hadn't just used sedatives. She had been lacing my food with lithium, a heavy metal used for psychiatric mood stabilization, but a lethal neurotoxin for the elderly if blood concentrations are not strictly monitored. It had induced the tremors, the profound disorientation, and eventually the onset of multi-organ failure. They wanted me to wither away, a death that would look like the natural drying of an old tree. At precisely 11 p.m., tires screeched in the driveway. Andrew returned. He was alone. He stumbled into the house, his breath heavy with the scent of cheap liquor, his clothes disheveled. When he saw me sitting at his father's desk, he froze, his bloodshot eyes reflecting a volatile mixture of terror and shame. "Mom, why are you still awake?" "I've been waiting for you, Andrew. Waiting to show you the results of the love you've given me," I said, sliding the folder toward him. Andrew picked up the papers, his hands shaking so violently the pages rattled. He stared at the crimson-inked figures, the annotations detailing the toxic concentrations. "What is this?" "That is the record of how you and your wife murdered me, day by day," I said, my voice as calm as if I were reciting a routine prescription. "Look at the lithium level. It's 3 times the safety threshold. Do you have any idea what it felt like as those levels climbed? I had horrific hallucinations. I saw Thomas standing in the corner. I saw you at 5 years old, crying. And then I realized you were the one holding the poisoned cup to my lips." Andrew collapsed to the floor, his forehead striking the edge of the oak desk. He began to sob, the guttural, choking sounds of a man who had traded his soul but still had enough conscience left to feel the weight of its loss. I didn't know. "Claire said it was just a mild sedative. She said you needed to rest, so we could handle the company. You didn't know, or you chose not to see." I stood up and walked toward him. "In medicine, the indifference of a loved one can kill a patient faster than cancer. You chose to blink when you saw the bruises on my arms. You chose to ignore my vacant eyes, all to trade for a glittering future built on the corpses of your parents." I produced one final vial, the one I had scavenged from Claire's secret medicine cabinet before she left. "This is what's left. I sent a sample to the police this afternoon. The combination of my blood work and this substance will be Claire's life sentence. And you, Andrew, you will be the accomplice of a calculated silence." Andrew looked up at me, his eyes pleading. "Mom, please, don't call the police. I'll fix it. I'll get you the best treatment." "Fix it?" I let out a dry, bitter laugh. "A cell that has undergone necrosis cannot be revived, Andrew. This family system is completely necrotic." I saved myself with medical knowledge and the last of my lucidity. "But for you, there is no hospital on earth that can treat the cowardice in your blood." I felt a sharp, brief constriction in my chest, the price of prolonged physiological stress. I checked my own pulse, feeling the extra systole, the skipped beats of a heart that was weary of its burden. I needed rest. But this night of judgment required a clean closure. Thomas always taught me that blood tests never lie. They expose every truth that human tongues try to bury. Tonight, my blood had spoken. It testified to betrayal, to greed, and to the spinelessness of the son I once loved more than life itself. Go, Andrew, go to the police station and tell the truth about Claire. If you want to keep even a shred of dignity to look at your father's photograph," I said, turning my back to him to stare out the window where the streetlights were beginning to dissolve the shadows. Andrew rose heavily, clutching the documents. He walked out the door, his footsteps sounding like a man dragging an eternal weight of guilt. I sat alone in the room filled with Thomas's memories. The truth was out. The hidden blood work had been brought into the light. My chest felt lighter not because of a victory, but because I had fulfilled my final duty as a wife and a mother, to dissect the rot and excise it to protect what was real. My ninth prescription: justice. It wasn't sweet like a promise, nor was it soft like a sedative. It was bitter and burning, but it was the only thing capable of debriding this wound. Tomorrow, the police would arrive. Tomorrow, the lawyers would begin their work. But tonight, I would sleep a deep, natural sleep, without sedatives, without the watch of traitors, because my blood was finally clean of the lies. The dawn of judgment did not arrive with a thunderclap, but with a soft ribbon of amber silk drifting through the study window. I sat there, bathed in the first light, feeling like a patient emerging from the recovery room after a grueling surgery to excise a metastatic tumor. The house was utterly hollow. Andrew had vanished into the night following his belated confession, and Claire was likely behind bars, her vanity stripped away by an interrogation lamp. I stood up. This time, my cane remained leaned against the wall, untouched. My body, after months of being ravaged by chemical toxins and the frost of neglect, was engaging in a miraculous process of homeostasis. With my mind finally uncoupled from the crushing weight of fear, my cortisol levels plummeted, yielding the floor to endorphins and serotonin, nature's own internal pharmacy. The ache in my joints softened, and my heart settled into a rhythmic, steady 70 beats per minute. I looked into the bathroom mirror. The age spots and deep-etched wrinkles remained, but my eyes were no longer clouded by the heavy veil of sedatives. They were the eyes of a woman who had stared into the abyss of betrayal and chosen to climb back out. I went to the kitchen and brewed a cup of jasmine tea. This time, no one served me, and there was no metallic tang of digoxin or lithium, only the ethereal scent of jasmine rising in a curl of white steam. I reclaimed my seat at the head of the dining table, but the unwanted relative was gone. I looked at the empty chairs. Andrew, Claire, Dr. Miller. They were merely transient entities that had passed through my life, leaving behind scars that served as a map for survival. At 8 a.m., a patrol car pulled up to the gate. The detective entered and handed me a final report. Mrs. Miller, Dr. Miller has made a full confession regarding the falsified records. Claire is facing charges of attempted murder. And your son, he has chosen to cooperate with the state. Your husband's original will has been legally reinstated. I nodded, my heart as still as a lake without a ripple. There was no surge of triumph, no celebratory cry. This victory tasted of salt and the bitter dregs of a shattered family. Thomas once told me, freedom is when your vital signs no longer depend on someone else's breath. For years, I had allowed my blood pressure to rise and fall with Claire's whims, allowed my heart to skip beats in rhythm with Andrew's cowardice. I had surrendered too much of my dignity in exchange for a hollow connection, leaving my soul's immune system depleted. Standing alone in the living room, I realized I had completed the most critical operation of my life, the total amputation of expectation from those I loved. Dignity is not a trophy to be won from others. It is the substance we stop giving away in vain. I stood firm on my own 2 feet, feeling the solid connection between my souls and the sturdy oak floor. Gravity was no longer my executioner. It was the proof that I still existed, that I still carried weight in this world. Andrew called me before being taken into further custody. He wept. He begged. He spoke of being a lost child. I simply replied, "Son, I saved your life one last time by bringing the truth into the light. The rest of the treatment is up to you." My final prescription: autonomy. I will sell this house, haunted as it is by medical ghosts. I will use the funds to travel to the places Thomas once dreamed of showing me. I will keep reading my anatomy books, not to defend myself, but to contemplate the wonder of life, a force that even poison cannot conquer if the will remains vibrant. The sun climbed higher, radiant and warm. I stepped onto the porch, drawing a deep breath to let oxygen flood my lungs, nourishing every cell that had once been cast aside. My name is Helen Miller. I am 75 years old, and today I begin my own life. No longer a victim, no longer senile. I am a woman, standing upright, holding the verdict of my own freedom, a verdict written in the blood, tears, and wisdom of a heart that never gave up.